Hi, my name is Gabe Eckhouse. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley in the geography department. This past spring, I taught a course on how humanity's changing relationship to the production of food has shaped who we are, biologically, socially, culturally, and more. In this video, I've been asked by Professor Martin to give a 15-minute summary of this course's content prior to the Industrial Revolution. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be synopsizing, in a very brief window of time, how humanity's changing relationship to its production of food has made us who we are this day. Now, we'll be looking at this in a very big picture way, going back all the way 2 million years ago to roughly 1800 AD. So it's going to be a very big picture video. Now, in this video, we'll look at three different things. The first point I want to examine is this question of fire and how fire helped make us who we are biologically. The second point that I want to look at is the origin of agriculture and how the development and intensification of agriculture societies originated certain forms of social relationships that remain with us to this day. The third and final point we'll be looking at is how our relationship to the production of food played a role in the origin of capitalism, which is the modern world we live in today. So let's dive into it. Fire. So fire is this amazing thing that everyone knows about. You think about it in terms of, keeping warm and having a story around the campfire. But fire also, I would argue, made us who we are biologically. Now, these ideas come principally from a Harvard researcher named Richard Wrangham, and his info will be in the links in this video. But the basic point we want to make about fire, and the basic point he makes about fire, is that fire allowed us to externalize our digestion. So by not relying on our ancestors' more complex and larger digestive system that was necessary to go and break down more complex food items, by not relying on that, because we can externalize that digestion process by going and cooking our food, that went and basically created a new biological pathway in human anatomy. Let me explain what I mean by this a little bit more. So this is a chart of human, or kind of an early human and pre-human evolution going back several million years ago. And it's a little idealized, a little rough. But as you can see, there's a very clear inflection point here, right? Around roughly 2 million years ago, which more or less corresponds with our current senses of when fire most likely began to be a more regular part of the early human experience. And what you see is this whole development in the size of our brain, like a really kind of radical shift in how large our brains were at this time. And to put it very simply, or kind of in a nutshell, given we have a very short period of time, the idea is that by being able to externalize our digestion, it allowed us to free up energy for other things, like our brains, which take a lot of energy. And so putting our relationship to food production during this time, right, us going and cooking our food, helped make us who we are biologically. How we cooked food transformed who we were as a species biologically. So that's the first point I want to make about how our relationship to food has changed over time and in turn changed who we are as a species. Let's now look at the second point I want to make. Our relationship to food has made us socially who we are today. So how is that? Why is that? About 10 to 15,000 years ago, you start to see another transformation taking place. Now, Homo sapiens have been around for about 200,000 years. And if you look in that top left corner, you see what's known as the Milankovitch cycles. These are cycles of global temperature from Ice Age to a warming period that would have been with us for the past million years. And what you can see is that there are predominantly colder periods with very short spikes of warming periods. Now, in all previous warming periods before our current warming period, known as the Holocene, those prior warming periods have not resulted in widespread agricultural societies, to our knowledge. There's no archaeological evidence to suggest that. So what I think happens here is that you have the convergence of two forces. On the one hand, you have the evolution of our early ancestors leading up to humans as we know them today, which roughly came about, between 200 and 150,000 years ago, but didn't actually spread out of Africa until about 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, depending on where you're looking. You have the convergence of us biologically emerging as a species with one of these warming periods. The last warming period, which happened, roughly 140,000 years ago or so, humans were just beginning to exist in certain limited parts of Africa, but for the most part, it was our predecessors like Homo neanderthals and various kind of descendants of Homo erectus that lived in different parts of the world. So when you have this convergence together, the argument is that, well, you have the ability to start going and producing food. You have not only a warm period, which is necessary for the production of agriculture, but also this development of human ingenuity and human culture. There must have been something about the convergence of these two forces which led to the development of agriculture. Where did this happen? A variety of different parts of the world, but one thing that's common in many of the earliest points of agricultural production, for example, the Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River, and in central Mexico, is that they were oftentimes based around wetland areas. So we'll look at this in the case of the Fertile Crescent. You had first not necessarily intensive agricultural societies emerge at this time, but rather what you had were societies that were sedentary because the warming period allowed them to gain access to a richer diversity of animals that they could hunt, as well as certain species of crops and wild fruit and vegetables. So what's key about these wetland areas is that these wetland areas, such as certain areas around the Fertile Crescent, were migratory hubs where you had a variety of different animals and a variety of different species of birds and big game coming through. And this diversity of life and the fact that each season brought with it a different section of this migration meant that there was a lot to hunt and a lot to gather. So what you see at this time is the emergence of early sedentary societies. But the key thing is that while some of these early sedentary societies might have begun to, at first, domesticate ancient forms of wheat and barley, those ancient forms of wheat and barley still were not their primary diet. It was kind of like a proto form of agriculture, where agriculture still wasn't the major way they got their caloric intake. So what shifted? What changed? Well, early agriculture was pretty labor intensive to our knowledge. And so it wasn't the case that you had these societies just kind of, rapidly endorsing and switching over to agriculture as soon as possible. But, and this is the second point that I released a little too early there, even though agriculture was not as labor efficient as hunting and gathering, it was more space efficient. So in other words, it might have taken more work for these folk to go and rely on agriculture, but it allowed them to produce more food per square foot. And so societies which intensified their reliance on agriculture achieved denser populations at a cost. And I'll give you some links to more information about this. So what's really interesting about this process is that this process of turning towards the intensification of agriculture, right? Not this early proto-agriculture where people are starting to first experiment with it, but rather the growth of, ancient societies like ancient Egypt and the kingdom of Ur and Samaria. These first ancient empires and first ancient civilizations as we know them had intensified their reliance on agriculture to the point where that was their primary source of food intake. And this period between this kind of proto-agriculture on the one hand and then this more intensified agriculture on the other hand was actually a pretty long period. It's about 5,000 or 6,000 years for that to take place. If you think about our history since agriculture began roughly 10,000 years ago or so, about half of that time was spent intensifying agriculture and the spread of agriculture, and then the other half of the time is kind of the more intensive reliance on agriculture leading to the growth of a variety of civilizations around the world. So it's a pretty big period of time where humans were shifting in the direction of what it meant to have an agriculture-based society. Now again, this is a very short video, and so I'm just giving a very short kind of overview of all of this, but let's look at a second what kind of social impacts this reliance on agriculture had towards the development of society and how that might be still relevant to us today, thinking about our current modern society. So I've got one of my little bullet points out of order there, so you'll have to ignore the warrior and priest group that's there. But what's going to happen here? So we've got the early agrarian intensification process. Early societies are relying more intensively on agriculture. What happens is that there's more intense work. You have things like the plow being invented, and you also have the growth of an agricultural surplus. Why are these two things important? Why is more work on the one hand and an agricultural surplus important? Well, to start off, when you have an agricultural surplus, you start to have a variety of things happening. First off, if you've got a surplus, and that surplus can last around in the form of a granary and grains inside that granary, you have the possibility of maybe going and stealing that surplus or conquering a neighboring village to go and acquire that surplus. And so there starts to, again, over a slow period of time, several thousand years, the growth of a kind of warrior caste where the defense of villages and the assaulting of other villages might become a little bit more important. Some of the earliest evidence of those who controlled granaries were also a kind of priestly group. So you might have had the emergence of certain kinds of organized religion where those in charge were overseeing the surplus. Now, at the same time, with the intensification of work, you also have this question of a division of labor, right? If you have more complex agricultural labor that needs to be done, and that labor is not particularly fun to do in the manual sense, you might, over a certain period of time, have the development of certain people who control the agricultural surplus and who designate what types of organization should happen to get the agricultural work done. And their labor is no longer kind of manual labor on the fields, but a sort of mental labor and kind of the labor of management. And so what you start to see during this time, and there's a lot of interesting articles on this trying to provide empirical evidence to what I'm saying, and I'll link to some of them in the description. What you see is the development as these agricultural societies grow of various types of inequalities. The first evidence of inequality emerges in human civilization in a kind of structural economic sense in what's called the Ubaid period, roughly 4,000 years ago or so, where you have really the intensification of kind of urban settlement, and again, urban settlement based off of these surpluses that were being produced through agriculture. Another aspect that comes with this is growth in gender inequality, something that's also been documented. So how does this change things, or what are the impacts here? Well, you have with all of these things the development of private property. You go back 20,000, 30,000 years ago, the conception of private property that existed at that time in most societies around the world was radically different from what would emerge as, more sedentary societies existed with, dwelling in one place forever, and thus being able to accumulate and acquire possessions. With this growth of a kind of warrior and priest caste that's going and overseeing the production of the key ingredient to life, food, you have also the development of various kinds of taxes, usually taken what's called in kind, meaning a peasant working on a farm would have to give off maybe a certain portion of their crop each year to the noble of sorts, or the warrior chieftain or priest that went and oversaw that village or that community. With this surplus, you also have trade, craftsmanship, and of course, importantly, the possibility for urbanism in certain settings. As these changes develop and this whole area around the Fertile Crescent becomes more developed, and a similar process happens in the other places where agriculture originated, you also have the growth of the first empires and conquest and war. I'm, of course, giving a very kind of broad overview of a complex period of time where archaeologists are every day finding new and interesting things in which, still ambiguity exists. But I think the key thing to sort of take away from this overall point is that, let's see here if I can switch my slide here. The key thing that I want to sort of take away from this point is that things like urbanism, things like states, things like inequality, class, all of these emerged with the development of agriculture. That is certain archaeologically. And so looking again at how humans produce food can really give some insight into the origin of another key part of human history, right? The origin of urbanism, the origin of class, the origin of inequality. This is what's called the Standard of Ur. It's one of the first depictions in human history of organized state-sponsored warfare, and in it you see the conquest of other people and the capture of slaves, something that didn't exist in history in the way that where you actually have slaves captured and taken so that you can force them to go and work on the fields. This was a unique, novel development, and again, finds its origin in agriculture and how agriculture changed society. The third thing I want to look at is how our relationship to food has made us who we are today in capitalism. So if we look at the three different periods we've looked at so far, the first period here, let's see if I can use this feature on PowerPoint. So this first period here, evolution, so that's talking about fire, going back, really this should go back to 2 million years ago over there, and going to 10,000 years ago. We see a certain part, this is a graph looking at the expansion of human population. And what you see is that there's a certain period of growth in the human population associated with our evolution biologically, and what I was describing earlier in terms of fire. So that was the first thing we looked at. Then the second thing we looked at today is the origin of agriculture, right? And more could be said about how it's spread in all different parts around the world, roughly, from 10,000 years ago when it originated, the past few hundred years, even in some parts of society today, or some parts of very isolated tribal communities may still have hunter-gathering traditions intact. So now the third kind of development I want to look at, associated with another increase in the human population, is capitalism. Later on in this course with Professor Martin, you'll be examining industrial agriculture, but I just want to say a few words about how our changing relationship to food production helped originate what we call the capitalist system. So, first point I want to make here is that during this whole antecedent time before the development of capitalism, let's say capitalism kind of starts coming about around 1600. I'm sure you all really enjoy my writing style there. There we go. That says 1600. So if that's somewhere around here on this kind of logarithmic graph, so it's a little hard to give an exact date, but if that starts around there, if you look at the antecedent time, right, like all the time prior to this, for a good portion of humanity's existence, there wasn't what we would call class. But for a certain portion of humanity's existence, with the development of agriculture, there was the development of class. Now, the thing that I want to say, though, is that how that system worked was that most people who lived during that time, roughly, 5,000 years ago to really just a few hundred years ago in most parts of the world, the vast majority of people lived as peasants, living off of their land. And those peasants, they would go and produce a large portion of their own food. And to the extent that they engaged in the market, going and buying and selling goods, although there were some exceptions in Rome and certain parts of the Song Dynasty in ancient China, and probably, some more exceptions in history, a lot of human activity during this broad time of agriculture was not associated with market activity. A lot of it was a mixture of kind of self-sufficient production, local production, certain kind of limited bartering, but most human beings didn't go to the grocery market and take out their paycheck, which they got from having a wage, and purchased items to go and eat. Most people were living on farms, producing what they needed. So this changes during capitalism, and I want to examine this. So how did food play a role in the emergence of a market-based society? Okay, so I'm going to give a very quick overview of complex period which you could write 35 dissertations on and still not have a full answer to, but I'm going to do my best to synthesize I think a few key areas of research that I think are relevant to this question. So the first thing I want to say is that in medieval Europe, where capitalism would eventually originate from, there were certain shifts in the relationship to food production, specifically the development of the iron plow and various types of harnesses for the horse, which allowed that plow to be more effectively used, that created what's called the medieval agriculture revolution. So the medieval agricultural revolution, and provide some links again in the description so that you guys can look more into this if you're interested in it, is thought to have increased the population of Europe roughly fourfold between, I think, 900 AD and 1200 AD. So what this allowed were most of northwestern Europe. It was very muddy soil that really wasn't suited to agriculture in terms of the pre-iron, pre-steel implements that predominated in antiquity. In Rome, for example, you would use what was called the ard, which was a kind of precursor to the plow, which was made out of wood to go and plow your fields. But in order to do this in medieval Europe, you really needed more sophisticated stuff. And so what happens during this time of the medieval agrarian revolution is a real transformation of the landscape in Europe from one of kind of various types of forested agriculture societies where you use basically slash and burn techniques, the burning down of forests to restore fertility, to go and create your food, to one where you had much more intensive use of animals and more sophisticated ironmongery to really go and plow huge stretches of field. So this development of agricultural production led to a huge expansion in the population, which led to things like, the kind of medieval world we think about with, fairs and market towns, kind of the emergence of a early kind of urbanism in that area. Now, with that comes crafts, and that's what this next little icon is about. Various kinds of, craftsmanship going on. And of course, a certain degree of money. Now, money still wasn't the major way most people lived, but it grew significantly during this time, especially among the elites who would be, purchasing various types of exotic goods to flaunt their wealth. But what happens, and this is a real key thing, is that the conquest of the Americas by Spain and to some extent Portugal bring in a tremendous amount of wealth, specifically silver, but also other things, including slaves and various types of commodity production. And this influx of wealth really goes and intensifies this early beginnings of a market society that we're seeing. So all of this kind of, especially the growth, the influx of silver from the New World. I don't know the exact amount, but I think I'll try to provide some citation for this, but I think something like roughly a sixth of all the world's silver was mined during this period by the Spanish from roughly 1500 to 1700 or so. So a huge quantity of silver comes out of the Americas, specifically from a place called Potosí in Bolivia. So that leads to the intensification of this market society. And again, people, and that more money means, more things. People are, especially elites, are buying various kinds of things. So it's incentivizing this market production. And what happens then in this climate, and here's the key thing I want you all to take away. What happens is that there then become a certain section of wealthier landowners who realize that they can make a lot of money if they go and improve their agricultural production and reorient their agricultural production away from their kind of old feudal estates where it's largely self-sufficient and you have, your knights and your feudal retainers, away from that, and instead towards money, towards making some cash money. So let me just give you an example of what this would look like. You could have in, say, 1600 in certain parts of England or the north of France, a decision by a wealthy aristocrat to say, let's go and purchase these plots of land or kick these peasants off this plot of land and go and what's known as enclosing the land and go and orient it towards sheep production for wool, right? And this wool would be very valuable because it would then be taken and sewn in some kind of craft house. And this little map here is just meant to indicate this enclosure movement. One of the effects of this, though, was that as they tried to commercialize and develop their land, it meant also that peasants who maybe previously were living on these estates in a sort of patchwork, complex array of obligations to their lords would be pushed out and forced to find another place to live, oftentimes being pushed into cities, becoming various kinds of either urban poor, or if they are lucky, finding some kind of job. This is what's known as the first modern agrarian revolution. To put it differently, the opportunity of a market society for agricultural goods incentivized certain land-owning elites and wealthier sections of the peasantry to consolidate and enclose land and improve it through more intensive use of early machinery and animals to go and produce goods to make a profit. So here we have the way in which a change in how we relate to the production of food is playing a role in the emergence of capitalism. What's key about this is that this whole system feeds on itself. Consider this. The more you push your peasants off the land because you want to buy up their states and buy up their land and create enclosed holdings for market production, the more you have a group of people that we would now call workers or the working class who don't have a home in the countryside where they're producing food for their family and instead are becoming reliant on a wage. So what you see here in all of this, in this whole period, is the emergence of more intensified urbanization, one, and then two, workers, the working class, people going and working for a wage, and then three, money, right? Going and really relying on money, where if you're a worker in a city, for example, and you need to buy some food, you have to go and buy it. You got to use your wage to go and purchase that food. Go back 200 to 300 years before that, that worker would not be in that city. He or she would be in the countryside on some kind of farm situation, going and producing most of their food in a more kind of self-sustenance sort of way. All right, let's see if we have anything else here. This is just, that arrow is just to indicate this whole cycle feeds back on itself. Oh, and just a quick little side note here, something that's also helping this process move along is coal. And in England in particular, as this process gets going, the ability to save forests and use coal for energy instead of wood allows for this proto-industrialization. Before the Industrial Revolution, roughly 1600 to 1800, during this early stage of capitalism, it allows these early crafts to go and flourish. Okay, so you just got hit with a quick synopsis of the history of capitalism. The point that I want to make, summing it all up, is that the incentivization of market-based food production for broader masses of people under a certain historical context helped a cascading series of social changes: urbanization, wage workers, money. And that's, of course, leads to what we call capitalism today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Again, summing up everything. First off, our changing relationship to the production of food through fire made us who we are biologically. 2, the development of agriculture helped originate certain social institutions like class, the division of labor, urbanism, states, and warfare that still remain with us to this day. 3, the way certain parts of humanity began producing food for the market roughly 400 years ago played a role in the development and emergence of the global society we now call capitalism. I hope during this video I've convinced you that understanding how humanity relates to the production of food is an interesting and worthwhile topic to explore. Please reach out to me if you want to know more. I'm happy to get in contact with you. And thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.